Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to Torah Studies. Today's class actually is pre-recorded because tonight we celebrate the bar mitzvah of Danny Rabayev. Mazel tov to the Rabayev family. And so I apologize that this is pre-recorded, but if you have any questions, of course, I'm always open for questions and clarifications later. So today, this week's parshah, CHUKAS-BALAK, we actually get together with, we rejoin the Israelis. Since Shavuos in Israel, they've been reading one portion ahead of us. And in this week, we join together. In Israel, we read the portion of Balak. And outside of Israel, we read two portions, Chukas and Balak. So today's subject, today's topic is about trauma and how to deal with trauma. Reframing the past to fortify the future. And of course, there's all types of traumatic events that people go through, and to know how to deal with trauma, certainly there's many types of traumas that needs professional intervention. And but there are obviously different levels, and the question is, what, after you deal with the situation, what do you do with the past traumatic events? Do you just forget and move on? Or do you let it revisit from time to time? Is that okay? Is there a benefit in this? And we're going to learn something from this week's portion, the second portion, the portion of Balak, something very interesting that Rebbe brings out. We'll begin with a very fascinating correspondence that the Rebbe wrote to a person that was, he had health concerns, and he dwelt on the health concerns. So the Rebbe writes to him as follows. The Rebbe writes to this person, with respect to your healing, I make the following recommendations. Number one, surely you're following the instructions of your physicians. Number two, to the extent that you can, stop dwelling on your health issues. Stop focusing on it. Get your mind away from this. And number three, says the Rebbe, strengthen your faith in God, for whom nothing is impossible. And number four, says the Rebbe, strengthen your bond to the tree of life. That is the Torah of Chassidus, the teachings of Chassidus. Divrei Elokim Chaim, the living words of God. So this letter is not something about a past event, past trauma, but this letter is something that the person is concerned with the future. He doesn't know what's going to be with his health and so on. And that the Rebbe tells him, take care of medically. Don't think about it. Focus your mind on other things and put your trust in Hashem and continue with adding good deeds and studying, connecting with the tree of life, which is the Torah. For after obtaining proper care, place your trust in God and fill your time with meaningful study and good deeds. So although this is something that about the future things that the person is concerned, but something similar can be also said about traumatic event that a person is going through, as we shall see what we learn from the story of this week's Torah portion. So as we mentioned, we read two portions. The portion of Chukas and Balak. Now the second portion, Balak. Who is Balak? Balak was one of the biggest anti-Semites. When the Jewish people, after traveling for 40 years in the desert, they finally came to the close to enter the land of Israel. And this king of Moab realized that he's not going to be able to overcome the Jewish people with conventional warfare. So he went and hired Bilam to curse the Jewish people. And he figured that would be the way he will be able to overcome the Jewish people, because Bilam was a person that his curses came true. Says the Medrash Tanchuma, in the history of anti-Semites, there was no greater anti-Semite, no hater of Jews than Balak. All other haters, says anti-Semites, but there in the Medrash says Sonim, the haters, those who hated Jews, all of them, they attacked the Jews by war and bondage. Sometimes we could survive, something we could survive. But Balak intended to weaponize Bilam's curse to destroy the entire nation. You can only imagine what kind of trauma this would be, to know Balak is coming and cursing, hiring Bilam to curse the Jewish people. And what do? Now we've passed, we know the story, it didn't happen. Bilam tried to curse the Jews, and he ended up blessing the Jews because Hashem controlled his words. So he issued words of blessings. But what do we do? What do we do now? Every year, we read the Torah, Parshas Balak. We read the name of Balak. We focus on it. We don't just let it go. We read and we name the portion Balak and after this anti-Semite, and we tell the story. So the question is, why dwell on traumatic experience and name the Torah portion after a well-known anti-Semite? The question is this question becomes even stronger because we know that the name of the wicked person must be rotten. As King Solomon says in Proverbs, it says, V'shem Rashoim Yerkav, the name of the wicked must be left to rot. And our sages indeed said, based on this, that we're not allowed to mention the name of a wicked person because that keeps his memory alive. And unless, when we mention him, we curse that name. This comes from the Medrash. Omar Rabbi Yitzchak said, one who utters the name of a wicked person but fails to add a curse transgresses a positive commandment. What is the source of this commandment? It says in the Proverbs, the name of the wicked must be left to rot. That is why when we mention the name of, you ever heard the expression, when we say Hitler, we say Hitler Yemach Shemo. Hitler Yemach Shemo, what does it mean? Hitler, may his name be erased. We don't mention otherwise name of wicked people. Similar thing we also find about the story with Amalek, right? Amalek is once a year, the Torah says, you got to erase the memory of Amalek. Amalek was the nation that was the original anti-Semites. And the Torah says we have to erase his name, but yet there's a mitzvah to mention the name every year. So we have to remember, we have to mention his name, but mention for the purpose of erasing. In addition is also there is a law that says that a person is not allowed to name his child after a wicked person. I don't know anybody who would be interested in naming his child Hitler, chas v'shalom, but in case a person never considered it, it is actually a prohibition. You're not allowed to do that. As we said, in the Talmud says, what is the meaning of the name of the wicked must be left to rot? Rabbi Elazar said, decay will spread on their names, but we will not name others by their names. We're not supposed to name others by the names. And Rashi explains, the commentator Rashi says, what does it mean? That the law that we don't name our children after wicked, ensuring obliteration of the names within a few generations. So the question then is, why do we name a portion in the Torah after this wicked anti-Semite who hated Jews so much? And if we want to tell the story of what happened, couldn't we just mention the story? There was a king of Moab and he wanted the curse, and why mention the name? What does it add to the story to mention the name? So to find insights on why it is permitted and even valuable to use the name of Balak, we will go in with a little more an explanation and something else. There is additional prohibition. There's another prohibition that talks about not mentioning the name of an idolatry. You're not allowed to mention names of an idol. And explaining and understanding why this law will also help us understanding why the name of Balak is mentioned in the portion. So the reason why we cannot mention an idol is not the same as the not mentioning the name of the wicked person, but nevertheless, it is similar in the prohibition. So that's the question, why do we name the portion Balak? So here we have in the Torah says, V'shem Elokim acherim lo tazkiru, do not mention the names of other gods. And as the Talmud says, do not mention names of other gods. For example, a person shouldn't say to someone, shouldn't say to someone else, wait for me beside a certain idol. So this is a prohibition in the Torah. You're not allowed to mention names of other idols. So what is interesting, though, that there is exceptions to the rule. Where do we see exception? So there's an interesting story in the Talmud. Talmud talks about Ulla. When the sage Ulla arrived, he overnighted in Kalenbo. Kalenbo was a city named after the idol around which it was built. So Rava asked him, where did the master overnight? And Ulla replied, in Kalenbo. Rava said, but does the passage not state, do not mention the name of other gods? And Ulla replied, and he said that there is an exception. And he said that so taught Rabbi Yochanan, that we are permitted to mention the name of any idol that appears in the Torah. So that name, that idol, Kalenbo, is indeed mentioned in the Torah, in the prophet Isaiah, in Yeshayahu, and there says Ula to Rava, that's why I mentioned the name, because it is already mentioned in the Torah. And an idol that is mentioned in the Torah is allowed to be mentioned. And the question is, why? Why is it okay to mention an idol that is mentioned in the Torah? Understanding this question will give us the answer also why it is allowed and why do we name a portion after Balak. So there's an exception to the prohibition when the name is mentioned in the Torah. The question is why. And there are actually many different answers that is given to these questions. We will mention two answers. One answer is based on the Tosfos, the commentary to the Talmud, that mentions a question about what it says in the Torah. In the Torah, Hashem says, when the Jewish people left Egypt, God says, "V'yeshuvu v'yachanu," and it says, "Lifnei Baal Tzefon." Let the Jews turn around and let them rest, let them settle in front of Baal Tzefon. Baal Tzefon is an idol, and the Torah mentions clearly that when God says to Moses, "Let the Jews come back," he wanted to confuse the Egyptians, that the Egyptians should think that their idol is actually protecting them, and the Jews cannot leave Egypt. That's why he told them, let them go back to Baal Tzefon. But isn't that the rule, that we're not allowed to mention a place of an idol, telling, as we just read, you cannot tell someone to wait next to this place, next to this idol? So this is in the Tosfos, the Hazakenim, in Baalei Tosfos. It says, the Torah says, in front of Baal Tzefon. I saw that Rabbi Yehuda wondered why God instructed Moses to have the Jews settle near the ocean in front of Baal Tzefon. Do we not say that it is forbidden to tell our fellow, wait for me before a certain idol? So Rabbi Yehuda concluded by observing that this is a difficult matter that requires deeper analysis. Tzarich iyun. You have to think about it, he said to him. However, the Tosfos says, it seems to me that the answer is simple. And he says something very interesting. He says, this prohibition was only ever binded on humankind. It was never binding. It was binding on humankind, but it was never binding on God. So that's a law that people cannot mention, but God is allowed. God is allowed to say that that law does not apply to God. That's answer number one. Why is it okay to mention in the Torah? Because God is allowed to mention the name of an idol. A person is not allowed to mention that. Then there's another answer. Another answer is from the Yereim, also the Sefer Yereim, Elazar of Mintz, also from the same era. And he says that the reason why something that is mentioned in the Torah is okay to mention, because if it's mentioned in the Torah, that idol was certainly obliterated already. So it says any idol mentioned in the Torah may be mentioned, and the reason, once it is mentioned in the Torah, it has certainly been obliterated. However, both answers are problematic. And the answer number one, that we said what? That any idol, the idol for God, it is permitted, but for the people, we are not allowed to mention. The question is, we know there is a rule that it says, there's a verse, we say, Magid Dvarov LeYaakov. Hashem says his words says to Jacob. And the Medrash says about this that whatever Dvarav, his words, Chukav Mishpatav LeYisrael, his laws he gives to Israel. What does it mean? His laws he gives to Israelites. His words he says to Yaakov. It means that the words and the laws that he gives to us, Jewish people, God himself observes. He goes by the same laws. It says when he tells us to put on tefillin, he also puts on a form of tefillin, obviously a spiritual kind of tefillin. So if Hashem tells us we should not mention any idols, we shouldn't mention Shem Elokim Lacherim Lo Tazkiru, why is it okay for God to do it? That's question number one. God, says the Medrash, is different from human lords. A human lord tells others what to do and does nothing himself. God is different. What he does, he tells the Jewish people to do. So it's very difficult to say that, yes, for us is forbidden, but for Hashem is permissible. And also, if that is the case, the fact is, we just learned from Ulla, another question is that Ulla said that if something is written in the Torah, for us is also permissible to say. And that we need to understand why. So although God is not bound by higher authority, he binds himself to his own laws. And then a question number two was also the other question was regarding the answer that we said that if it's written in the Torah, then it is canceled. He says the Yereim said that once it's written in the Torah, any idol that is written in the Torah is no longer. But the fact is, we know there are many idols that is mentioned in the Torah, and later on the Torah tells us about people worshiping that idol. So what does that mean? And the Rebbe here comes and gives us really a fundamental answer. He says that answer really both questions. He says when the Torah mentions an idol, the mentioning of the idol in the Torah is there to change. It is there to obliterate the idol. Is there to show how this idol is nothing and is empty and has no power. It is to ridicule the idol. And this is why when it's mentioned in the Torah, it is okay for us to mention. In the same way, after the Torah is written about it, and the Torah obviously writes about the idol in a negative way and showing how it is nothing and how it has no power whatsoever, then it is okay for us to mention. Because when we mention this in the same way that Torah mentions it, in a way that it was obliterated, even though people would still go and worship it, but the Torah already mentioned to us how this idol is nothing. That's basically what the Rebbe tells us. Says the Rebbe, to answer Rabbi Eliezer ben Shimon Yereim, what he meant to say was that names of false deities mentioned in the Torah are obliterated in the minds of the Jews who mention them. When the Torah mentions the name of a false deity, it is certainly to underscore its vanity, emptiness, and absolute lack of power. The Torah seeks to highlight the idol's utter falsehood and the error of those who worship it. So it follows that the appearance of a false deity's name in the Torah reverses and nullifies any supposition that it might have power. On the contrary, it underlines the idol's emptiness and falsehood. By the same token, when we mention the name of idols that appear in the Torah with similar intention, we too dismiss the idol's importance and substance. Idols that the Torah revealed to be without substance are as good as obliterated in our minds when we mention their names. Under such conditions, we are permitted to mention the name of an idol for the same reason that the Torah mentions it. That is why, if the Torah mentions it, for us, it is permissible to mention, because that's exactly what we're doing, mentioning it in order to obliterate it. So this is an answer to the question that we asked, how is it okay? Why is it okay for us to mention a name of an idol if it's mentioned in the Torah? But what about the other question? The question we asked, why is it okay to God, but it's not okay to us? Where the Tosfos says, for God, it's okay to mention. For us, it's not okay to mention. And the answer is the same, as the Rebbe goes on to explain. When Hashem mentions, why can't we mention the Torah? Obviously, Hashem does everything what He commands us. But He tells us not to mention the name of Avodah Zorah, why, of an idol worship, because that empowers, gives some importance to the idol worship. But this is something that is ridiculous to say about Hashem. That is something that Hashem, when He's saying for Hashem it's allowed, it means that God, by definition, defies idolatry. So for Hashem to mention, when He mentions those names, it is to obliterate it, the idol worship. So Hashem, that is why this is something for Hashem to mention is okay. For us to mention, it's not okay, because we mention, if it's not mentioned in the Torah, when we mention the idols, we give it some type of importance. But by God, that statement is ridiculous. Hashem doesn't give importance for anything which is not God. Says the Rebbe, when ordinary people mention the name of an idol, their intention is to use it as a reference, especially if they mention it for a significant purpose, such as referencing a meeting place. Unintentional as it might be, using the idol as a reference lends it significance. But from God's perspective, however, the error of attributing significance to idolatry is impossible. On the contrary, When the true God mentions a false deity's name, or if it appears in his Torah, it is perforce nullified. The very articulation and revelation of absolute truth dismisses and excludes even the glimmer of a supposition that an idol is anything but utter falsehood. Similarly, when ordinary Jews in the same spirit utter an idol's name that appears in the Torah, they too highlight and underline the idol's complete lack of power. That is why when it's mentioned in the Torah and God nullified it, in that sense, we are allowed to mention these idols because this is for the purpose of nullification. So God mentions idols in our presence to obliterate their legitimacy for us. And that is why in the story, Ula mentioned the name of the place that he slept over at night, that place of an idol, because he's mentioning he was a tzaddik. That was an idol that is already mentioned in the Torah. And mentioning in the Torah, as we said, means that it gives the power to completely nullify it and show its absolute nothingness. That is why his mentioning of that name on that place is in order to give more nullification, to obliterate it even more. That is why it was okay for him to mention this name of the idol. And a similar explanation can be said also regarding mentioning the names of the wicked people. Just like the mentioning of the idols cannot be done unless it is to obliterate them. Similarly, although it's not exactly the same prohibition, but for a similar reason, also the names of the wicked, there is an exception. A similar exception that we have for the idols, we have similar exception for mentioning the name of the wicked people. The Chidah, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Yosef David Azulai says, Rabbi Yochanan taught in the Talmud, we are permitted to mention the name of any idol that appears in the Torah. And similarly, says the Chidah, we should be permitted to mention names of wicked people that appear in the Torah. And why is that? Because that's the purpose of mentioning them. The purpose is to show how they are nothing. Our purpose, when the names of the wicked are mentioned in the Torah, it is to reverse their power. And such mentions empowers us to overcome the trauma and put the wickedness to bed. And that's what the Rebbe tells us. It says, the Torah tells us the story of Balak to broadcast the breakdown of his evil plan. He said to Bilam, please come and curse these people for me. Perhaps I will be able to wage war against them. And this plan was foiled. This is not in conflict with the dictum, the name of the wicked must be left to rot. On the contrary, such mention increases his shame and accelerates the rot of his wicked name. The same is true of naming the Torah portion after Balak. When we use the name Balak in reference to a Torah portion, we refer to him as the Torah does. Not to perpetuate his name, but to amplify his shame. To show how out of all his plans, nothing came out. So we have a choice not to mention the name and let it be forgotten. But then, what do we accomplish? And it's forgotten. But when we mention the name of the wicked, telling the story, not just ignoring them, we're doing the opposite. What we accomplish, it's more than just by ignoring it. We undermine, this undermines them and accentuate their self-destruction. That's why we mention the name, to remind ourselves again and again and again. Balak wanted to destroy us. Bilam wanted to curse us. What did Hashem do? He removed. He wasn't able to do it. But not only that, not only was he not able to curse the Jewish people, not only do we negate the negative, we also generate the positive. Because what happened with the plan of Balak and Bilam, they wanted to curse. But what happened? God turned the curses into the most unbelievable blessings. Unbelievable blessings that we got in the portion, including the blessings of the coming of Mashiach, is mentioned in this Torah portion of Balak. These curses turned into blessings. That is very powerful. Says the Rebbe, Balak's evil intentions were not only neutralized, as when an idol is obliterated, rather hiring Bilam also helped the Jews. It resulted in transcendental blessings for the Jewish people. This is much greater achievement than neutralizing a false deity. When we nullify a false deity, a denial of God's unity, we must obliterate it. Balak's story is different. The wickedness and hatred that caused him to hire Bilam to curse the Jews were not merely neutralized, they ended up aiding the Jews with transcendental blessings. This is an even deeper reason for naming the Torah portion after Balak, because through him, more accurately by him hiring Bilam, the destiny of the Jewish people was enhanced. So by reading the story of Balak, we are reminded that God has our back. As we say every day after davening, we say, Al tira me pachat pisa im Mashiach Hashem kitzavei. Fear not sudden terror or the destruction of the wicked when it comes. Utsu eitze v'tufar, dabra dava v'lo yokum ki manukein. They may take counsel, but it will be foiled. They may speak words, but their plan will not succeed, for God is with us. Immanuel. God is with us. And that basically is the answer to the question that we started. We're talking about trauma. Talking about trauma, how to deal with trauma. Do we have to let it go? Or do we have to deal with it? We have to let it remind ourselves about the trauma that we went through. And the answer is, if having the trauma in your mind will drag you down, will paralyze you, certainly, you have to put it in the past. But if you can find a way to take this trauma and become stronger, then certainly that's what should be done. There was once a Jew that came to the Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Ben Zion Wiener. And he had a private audience with the Rebbe. And he told the Rebbe about something that really sits in him and bothers him for many, many years. he had lent someone a large amount of money, and the guy never paid it back. And it really sat on him and bothered him. He's trying to help, and how does God allow this thing to happen that he loses so much? And the Rebbe told him, sometimes it is ordained from heaven. It is meant to be that a person should lose a certain amount of money. Could have been, and God forbid a person gets sick and he has to spend the money to a doctor. And Hashem, in his kindness, turned it in a way that it had to be, and he lost it, but somebody was helped with that money. Not to justify anything what that person did, whether he could pay back, couldn't pay back, whatever. But the fact is that God made it that it should happen in that way. So you're taking a traumatic event in that sense, and you reframe it. And he wrote that Rabbi Benzin Winner said, he ended up writing that he says, instead of losing money with tears, I could lose it with a smile. So, and that's the point. The Rebbe wrote to Eli Wiesel about the traumatic events and the horrible memories of the Holocaust and focusing on the terrible things. And the Rebbe said how the focus should be on the positive and how to build. And there is a letter that I'm going to read what the Rebbe wrote to him about it. I'll see inside. It says, we can plainly see that sad memories enhance our pessimism for the present and for the future. In turn, pessimism depletes our energy, which shuts down all creativity and efforts to rebuild. For such enterprises, specifically require trust in God and joyful disposition. We reframe traumatic memories in healthy ways that empower us. We highlight God's protection and our strength, leading us to action. And the Rebbe continues to write to Eli Wiesel, he says, in our post-Holocaust era, we cherish the memory of the sacred martyrs. May God avenge their deaths. It is important that our generation know about the Shoah, and even more important, that they never forget that the 6 million sanctified God's name. On the other hand, considering the teaching of our sages that action is primary, it is most important that we remember our greatest obligation to respond to the Holocaust by doing all that we can to rebuild our lives, rebuild the lives of Jews and the verve of Jewish life in the greatest quantitative and qualitative measure. This is the correct response and the correct war to wage against Hitler, Yimach Shemo, and his successors, may their names be obliterated, that's Yimach Shemo, who sadly, rather than having decreased, have perhaps even increased, albeit in alternate forms and guises. And that's what the Rebbe says to us. And that is the message. That is the message. Yimach Shemo, the wicked names be erased from history, but at the same time, we will ensure that Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people, will live on forever. And that is true with our personal trauma also. It was in 1956, I believe. Early in the history of the Jewish nation, 1956, in April 11, 1956, in the small village of Kfar Chabad in Israel. This was a village that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe established. People came from Russia, and after suffering Stalin and all the escaping the Holocaust and so on, they came and they started building a village, a Chabad village. Today it's flourishing, a big village. But it was in the beginning, and then a terrible, terrible tragedy happened there. A terrible, horrible terrorist attack. There was a school there with agricultural school that they had, and some Arab jihadists went in there, and they opened fire. They killed 5 children and the teacher. And you can only imagine what went through these people that they thought they're going to come to the Holy Land, to Israel, they're going to establish and be safe, and a pogrom right there in their village. And what was even more difficult for them is that the Rebbe did not respond for 4 days. They didn't hear from the Rebbe. And then after 4 days, they got an answer, a telegram from the Rebbe. And the words, the telegram was, not sure I remember the exact words, but the Rebbe told them, with the building, future building, you will be consulted. You will be comforted. And that really gave them the strength. The very next day, when they got this telegram, they started focusing. And in that same spot, they built a whole new vocational school. And they became much bigger, much greater. And then they found out what happened back in New York. And that night that this happened, the Rebbe was about to begin a Reframing, a gathering of the Hasidim. And the Rebbe's secretary got the phone call from Israel that this is what happened. But he didn't want to tell the Rebbe until after the Reframing. But somehow the Rebbe felt it. And the Rebbe, in the entire Reframing, the Rebbe spoke about people who sacrifice and give their lives and sanctifying God's name. And the Rebbe cried a lot and that Reframing. And after the Reframing was over, there was singing, saying L'chaim, the Rebbe was talking and crying. And after the Reframing was over, the Rebbe's secretary told the Rebbe about this event. The Rebbe went into the room, and the Rebbe did not go out of his room for 3 days. And after that, the Rebbe sent out this telegram. We don't know what went through the Rebbe's mind. We cannot understand what the Rebbe is saying. The Rebbe later on sent a group of shluchim to bring encouragements to the people. But this is what it means. You take something that happens and you use it to become stronger. You use it to build, as the Rebbe said, you will be comforted with the building, with the doing. And the same thing with everything what happens. When we find we're able, as long as the trauma does not paralyze us and bring us down, if we're able to focus on things and say, let's see the positive, let's see how we can become stronger from the tragedy that went through, that is definitely the right way to do. And may Hashem help. We should have no more traumas. We should have only good things, only positive things. And the key points we learn from this class: the name of the wicked may only be mentioned if accompanied by a curse, such as may his name be obliterated, Hitler Machshamo. The name of an idol may only be mentioned if it appears in the Torah. Its appearance in the Torah perforce reveals its utter lack of substance. Thus, we can say it with total revulsion and ridicule. And number 3, we don't dwell on the names of the wicked people and the terrible things they did. Similarly, we don't dwell on the memory of trauma and let it define us. We focus on living our lives. However, 4, if the memory of the trauma can be enhanced and framed in a positive, life-affirming way, it behooves us to remember it and to frame it that way. And number 5, this is especially true for traumas that are too large to forget. Any attempt to do so would backfire. Certain traumas we cannot just forget. So if you cannot forget it, then certainly you should reframe it. You should certainly focus on the positive. Have a wonderful week. Me'ezrat Hashem, we should have Mashiach now. All the best.